January 18, 1943. The Leningrad Front. For months, rumors had been circulating among the Red Army troops. They whispered of a new German monster. A tank so thick that shells bounced off it like peas. A tank with a gun that could kill a T-34 from across the horizon. Soviet intelligence dismissed these as soldiers' tales. They believed the Panzer IV was the heaviest tank Germany could field. But during Operation Iskra, the attempts to break the siege of Leningrad, the rumors became solid steel. A Soviet patrol from the 18th Rifle Division was moving through a peat bog near Workers' Settlement No. 5. The ground was treacherous. But ahead of them, stuck fast in the mud, was a shape they didn't recognize. It was massive. Boxy. It had a long 88mm gun with a distinctive muzzle brake. It was Tiger 100 of the Schwerpanzerabteilung 502, Heavy Tank Battalion 502. The German crew had tried to scuttle it. They set demolition charges. But in their haste to escape the encircling Russians, the fuses failed or were cut. The tank was intact. It was the intelligence prize of the war. The Soviet soldiers approached it cautiously, half expecting it to roar to life. They climbed onto the hull. They marveled at the width of the tracks, so much wider than their own. They knocked on the armor. It sounded dull and incredibly thick. They realized immediately that this was the ghost the troops feared. They radioed headquarters. "We have captured the monster." The news traveled up the chain of command with lightning speed. From the division, to the army group, to Moscow. General Zhukov ordered the tank to be guarded by a special detachment. It was to be towed to the rear immediately. Nothing was to happen to it. The Germans knew what they had lost. Hitler was furious. He ordered the Luftwaffe to bomb the abandoned tank to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. But the Soviets camouflaged it. They dragged it out of the bog under artillery fire. They put it on a train. The destination was the Kubinka Proving Ground. And the ultimate recipient of the report was the man in the Kremlin. Joseph Stalin was not a man who liked surprises. When the report on the Tiger reached his desk, he summoned his top military advisors and his tank designers. The meeting in the Kremlin was tense. The air was thick with tobacco smoke from Stalin's pipe. General Voronov, the head of artillery, laid out the photographs and the preliminary measurements taken by the engineers at Kubinka. "Comrade Stalin," Voronov reported. "The frontal armor is 100 mm thick. The side armor is 80 mm. Stalin looked at the numbers. He knew the T-34's main gun was a 76 mm weapon. He knew it struggled to penetrate 50 mm of armor at combat ranges. "And our guns?" Stalin asked softly. "What can our guns do to it?" Voronov hesitated. "At standard combat ranges, nothing, Comrade Stalin." The room went silent. Stalin stood up. He paced the room. This was a crisis. The T-34 had been the superior tank of 1941 and 1942. It had saved Moscow. It had saved Stalingrad. Now, the Germans had leaped ahead. If the Germans could produce these Tigers in large numbers, the Red Army's armored spearheads would be blunted. Stalin turned to Koting, the famous heavy tank designer. "We have been sleeping," Stalin said. "We have been content with the T-34 while the fascists have been forging a new sword." He picked up a photograph of the tiger. He didn't yell. His voice was cold and low. "This machine," he said, pointing to the tiger. "It is a problem. Problems must be solved." He looked at the assembled generals. "Find out where it is weak. Find out how to kill it. And build me a gun that can put a hole through it." He didn't ask if it was possible. He demanded it. "You have 2 weeks to test it," Stalin ordered. "Then I want answers." The meeting was over. The engineers left the room sweating. They knew that in Stalin's Russia, failure to solve a problem was often fatal. At the Kubinka Proving Ground, the captured tiger was subjected to an execution. Soviet engineers set the German tank up as a target range. They lined up every anti-tank weapon in the Soviet arsenal. They started with the 45mm anti-tank gun, the standard infantry weapon. They fired from 500 meters. Clang! The shells shattered harmlessly against the tiger's front plate. They moved closer. 200 meters. Clang! The engineers noted, useless. Then they brought up the T-34-76. The pride of the Red Army fired its 76mm main gun. From 500 meters, the shells bounced. From 200 meters, the shells gouged the armor but didn't penetrate. Only at point-blank range, firing into the side armor at a perfect 90-degree angle, could the T-34 achieve a penetration. The engineers were horrified. This meant that in a tank duel, a T-34 had to essentially ram a tiger to kill it, while the tiger could kill the T-34 from 1,500 meters. They tried the 85mm anti-aircraft gun. This was a heavy, towed weapon. It fired. Crack! The shell punched through the tiger's front plate. A cheer went up from the observers. Then they brought out the big guns. The 122mm core gun and the 152mm howitzer. The 122mm shell hit the tiger's turret. It didn't just penetrate, it cracked the welds. The sheer kinetic energy knocked the turret off the ring. The 152mm high-explosive shell blew the tiger apart. The report was written immediately. The tiger is invulnerable to our standard tank guns. It can only be destroyed by heavy artillery or anti-aircraft guns. This was a disaster for the tank corps. You can't mount a massive towed artillery piece on a standard tank chassis easily. The engineers realized they had to redesign the entire Soviet armored force. They had to fit the 85mm gun into the T-34. And they had to put the 152mm gun on tracks. The testing ground echoed with the sound of shots and the sound of frantic welding. The race was on. When the results were brought back to Stalin, he didn't look at the failures. He looked at the successes. He pointed to the report on the 85mm anti-aircraft gun. "Why is this gun not in a tank?" he asked. "It is too big, Comrade Stalin," the designers replied. "The turret ring of the T-34 is too small." "Make it bigger," Stalin said. "And this one?" He pointed to the 152mm howitzer. "That is a heavy artillery piece. It weighs tons. Put it on a chassis, Stalin ordered. We do not need a turret. Just put the gun on track so it can follow the tanks. He understood the essence of the problem. The Tiger relied on quality and armor. The Soviet response would rely on caliber. Stalin didn't care about ergonomics. He didn't care about reload speed. He wanted a weapon that could knock the head off a tiger with one blow. He authorized the immediate production of the Su-152. It was a rush job. A 152mm howitzer mounted on a KV-1 tank chassis. No turret. Just a massive gun pointing forward. It was crude. It was ugly. But it carried a shell that weighed 43 kilograms, 95 pounds. Stalin signed the order. Stop making the old light tanks, he said. They are coffins. Give me the beast killers. This decision changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. Stalin realized that the era of the medium tank duel was over. The era of the heavy tank had begun. And he was determined that the Soviet Union would have the biggest gun on the battlefield. The capture of Tiger 100 had woken the bear. And the bear was reaching for a sledgehammer. The crisis of 1943 was existential for the Soviet tank arm. The Tu-34, the hero of 1941, was now a victim. Its 76mm gun was like a pea-shooter against the frontal armor of the new German Cats, the Tiger, and the Panther. Soviet tank crews knew it. Their morale plummeted. They called their once-beloved T-34s thin-skinned coffins. Stalin's order was clear: put the 85mm anti-aircraft gun into the T-34. It sounded simple. It was an engineering nightmare. The 85mm gun had a massive breech block and a long recoil stroke. The standard Tu-34 turret was designed for 2 men and a small gun. It was already cramped. When engineers at factory number 112 tried to wedge the big gun into the existing turret, there was no room for the crew to move, let alone load the shell. The solution was radical. They had to design an entirely new turret. It had to be bigger, wider, and hold 3 men, adding a dedicated loader, which greatly improved efficiency. To fit the bigger turret, they had to widen the turret ring on the hull from 1,420mm to 1,600mm. This meant retooling the entire production line in the middle of a desperate war. It was a frantic race against time. Engineers worked 20-hour days, sleeping on the factory floor next to their blueprints. By December 1943, the first Tu-34-85 rolled off the assembly line. It looked similar to its predecessor, but the bigger turret gave it a more menacing profile. Crucially, the 85mm gun, the DR-5T and later ZS-53, changed the math. It could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at 500 meters and its side armor from over a kilometer. It wasn't a perfect solution. The Tiger's 88mm gun was still superior, but the Tu-34-85 was no longer helpless. It gave the Soviet crews a fighting chance. The capture of Tiger 100 had forced the Soviets to evolve their main battle tank just in time for the decisive battles of 1944. While the Tu-34-85 was the medium-weight answer, Stalin still wanted his sledgehammer. He wanted a vehicle that didn't just penetrate the Tiger, but obliterated it. The result was the Su-152. It was a weapon born of pure, brute utility. The designers took the heavy chassis of the KV-1's tank. They removed the turret. Instead, they built a fixed, armored casemate superstructure on top of the hull. Inside this steel box, they mounted the massive ML 2152mm gun howitzer. This was a piece of corps-level artillery, usually towed by tractors and fired indirectly at distant targets. Putting it on tracks for direct fire was an act of desperation and genius. The Su-152 was crude. It had no turret, so the entire vehicle had to turn to aim the gun horizontally. Inside, it was a nightmare for the five-man crew. It was cramped, hot, and filled with fumes when the gun fired. The ammunition was enormous. Each shell weighed over 90 pounds and was loaded in two parts, projectile and propellant charge. The rate of fire was agonizingly slow, perhaps 2 rounds per minute on a good day. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the projectile. The Soviet troops, seeing this ungainly monster roll up to the front lines, immediately understood its purpose. They christened it Zverobai, the beast killer. It was specifically designed to hunt the German animals, the tigers, panthers, and Ferdinands. Stalin's demand for a big gun had created a new class of weapon, the heavy assault gun, capable of knocking out any vehicle on Earth with a single shot. By the summer of 1943, the intelligence gleaned from the captured Tiger 100 was about to be put to the ultimate test. Hitler was preparing Operation Citadel, a massive pincer movement designed to cut off the Kursk salient. He delayed the attack repeatedly, waiting for more Tigers and the new Panther tanks to arrive from the factories. This delay was a fatal error. It gave the Soviets time to prepare. Marshal Zhukov, armed with the knowledge of the Tiger's capabilities and limitations, built the most formidable defensive network in history. He knew the Tiger was slow. He knew its side armor was vulnerable to 76mm and 85mm fire. He didn't try to match the Germans' Tank 4 tank in open battle. Instead, he built traps. The Soviets constructed deep defensive belts packed with anti-tank guns. They created pack fronts, batteries of up to 10 anti-tank guns hidden under camouflage, all commanded to fire simultaneously at a single target. They dug their T-34s into the ground, hull down, so only their turrets were visible, turning them into steel pillboxes. They laid over 1 million mines, specifically designed with extra explosives to break the heavy tracks of the Tigers. The plan was to channel the German heavy armor into pre-registered killing zones. When the German Tigers attacked in July 1943, they didn't find a disorganized enemy they could steamroll. They found an enemy that knew their exact engagement ranges. The German spearheads were blunted by layers of defenses explicitly designed to counter heavy armor. The capture of that single tank in a Leningrad peat bog 6 months earlier meant that the German wonder weapon was no longer a surprise, it was a known variable in Zhukov's deadly equation. The Battle of Kursk was the debut of the Su-152. It was where the theory of the beast killer met the reality of combat. On the southern flank of the salient, German heavy armor was pushing hard. A formation of Tigers, supported by the massive Ferdinand tank destroyers, was advancing across the steppe. They felt invincible. Their frontal armor was impervious to standard Soviet guns. Waiting in a tree line, camouflaged with branches and netting, was a regiment of Su-152s. The Soviet commanders waited. They let the Germans get closer. 1,200 meters. 1,000 meters. Fire! The ground shook as the 152 mm howitzers roared. A massive, high-explosive, shell arced through the air. It wasn't an armor-piercing rod, it was basically a flying bomb. It struck the frontal armor of a leading Tiger. The physics of the impact were terrifying. The shell didn't necessarily penetrate the armor. It didn't need to. The sheer kinetic energy of the 95-pound shell traveling at supersonic speed, combined with the massive explosion of the TNT filler, created a shockwave that defied belief. Inside the Tiger, the crew would have been instantly incapacitated by the concussion. The impact was so violent that it caused spalling. Shards of steel flaked off the inside of the Tiger's own armor plate, turning the interior into a blender of razor-sharp metal. Often, the force of the blast would shear the massive steel bolts that held the Tiger's turret to the hull. Observers reported seeing the entire 11-ton turret of a Tiger lifted into the air and thrown sideways off the tank. Another shell hit a Ferdinand tank destroyer. The explosion cracked the hull welds open, and the vehicle burned fiercely. In one engagement, a Major Sankovsky commanding an Su-152 unit destroyed 10 German tanks in a single day. The German crews were horrified. They were used to seeing shells bounce off their armor. Now, they were being hit by weapons that could rip their tanks apart through sheer brute force. The Zveroby had arrived, and the myth of German invincibility was shattered by 152 mm of Soviet high explosive. By late 1943, the Soviet engineers had one final answer to Stalin's demand. The Su-152 was a stopgap, an artillery piece on tracks. The Tu-34-85 was a medium tank. Stalin wanted a heavy tank that could dominate the battlefield. A tank that carried his name. The IS-2, Iosif Stalin II. It was the culmination of the lessons learned from the captured Tiger. The designers looked at the German 88mm gun and decided to go bigger. Much bigger. They selected the 122mm AR-19 core gun. This was a weapon of terrifying power. It fired a shell weighing 25 kilograms, 55 pounds. The kinetic energy was so massive that during tests, a dummy round, without explosives, punched through the front armor of a captured Panther, went through the engine block, and exited the rear plate. It skewered the German tank from end to end. The IS-2 was designed to take a hit, too. Its frontal armor was 120 mm thick, but it was sloped and cast in a streamlined shape. It offered better protection than the Tiger I, yet the IS-2 weighed less, 46 tons vs 57 tons. When the first IS-2 regiments arrived at the front in early 1944, they were designated as Guards Heavy Breakthrough Regiments. Their job was simple: find the Tigers and kill them. The IS-2 had a slow rate of fire, about 2 rounds per minute, because the ammunition was heavy and two-piece. But it didn't matter. In a duel, if the IS-2 hit the Tiger died. If the shell penetrated, the ammunition inside the Tiger usually detonated, blowing the turret hundreds of feet into the air. Even if it didn't penetrate, the high explosive round was powerful enough to crack the hull or knock the crew unconscious. The Stalin tank was the hammer that the Red Army had been waiting for. It was the physical manifestation of Soviet revenge. For the German panzer crews, 1944 was the year the nightmare reversed. Since 1941, they had relied on the superiority of their machines. They knew they were outnumbered, but they believed they could kill the enemy from a safe distance. The IS-2 erased that safety. German Tiger commanders reported engaging Soviet tanks at 2,000 meters, their usual safe killing zone. Suddenly, their own tanks were exploding. The 122mm gun had the range and the accuracy to reach out and touch them across the vast steppes. The psychological impact was profound. The hunter had become the hunted. German tactical manuals were hastily rewritten. They advised Tiger crews not to engage IS-2s in a frontal duel unless the range was very short. Avoid the Stalin tanks, the orders went. Flank them. But flanking was difficult when the Red Army was advancing on a broad front, supported by endless waves of T-34s and aircraft. The German crews began to feel the weight of the industrial disparity. They were nursing their fragile, complex machines, terrified of a breakdown, while the Soviets were rolling forward in tanks that were rugged, simple, and carried a gun big enough to sink a ship. The arrogance of the Tiger crews evaporated. They realized that the Soviets hadn't just copied them, they had surpassed them in the one metric that the Germans valued most: firepower. The IS-2 spearheaded the assault on Berlin. They were the battering rams that smashed the final defenses of the Reichstag. But the true shock to the world came after the shooting stopped. September 7, 1945. The Allied victory parade in Berlin. The war was over. American, British, French, and Soviet troops marched together. General George Patton and other Western commanders watched from the reviewing stand. Then, a low rumble shook the ground. Rolling down the Charlottenburger Chaussee came the IS-3. This was the successor to the IS-2. It had arrived too late to fight Hitler, but it was there to send a message to the West. It looked like a creature from another planet. It had a pike nose, angled armor plates that maximized deflection. It had a low, hemispherical turret that looked like an overturned soup bowl. It carried the massive 122mm gun. The Western generals were stunned. They looked at their own tanks, the tall, flat-sided Shermans, and realized they were obsolete. The IS-3 was a masterpiece of armor design. It was decades ahead of anything the West had. It triggered a panic in the West that would last for years. The British hastily developed the Conqueror tank, and the Americans built the M103 just to counter this new Soviet monster. The IS-3 was the direct descendant of that moment in the peat bog in 1943. Stalin's order to solve the problem had not only defeated Germany, it had created a weapon that would define the Cold War. Today, if you visit the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, now Patriot Park, you can walk through halls filled with steel giants. And there, sitting quietly, is a Tiger Eye. It is rusted. It is silent. But this specific tank, Tiger 100, is one of the most important artifacts of military history. Its capture in January 1943 changed everything. If that German crew had successfully scuttled their tank, if the fuse had worked, the Soviets might have remained ignorant of the Tiger's true capabilities for months longer. They might not have upgunned the T-34 in time for Kursk. They might not have built the IS-2 in time for Bagration. The course of the war on the Eastern Front pivoted on that single failure of a German demolition charge. Stalin's reaction, his cold, pragmatic demand for a beast killer, demonstrated the ruthless efficiency of the Soviet war machine. They didn't panic. They engineered a solution. The German commanders had mocked the primitive Russians. They believed their superior technology would always save them. But in the end, their technology was captured, dissected, and used to forge the hammer that smashed the Third Reich. The tiger woke the bear. And the bear bit back.